Good evening, and welcome. This is the sixth of a series called The Earth as a Freudian Spaceship, and this is a kind of seminar course. Details are in the previous ones. You can kind of find out if you want to know what's going on. But basically, I'm going to chat and not really do a lecture, but I'm going to chat for about an hour, and then there'll be a kind of conversation, a private conversation for about an hour in a seminar. There is a Discord you can get in touch with if you're interested in getting in conversation. But this is the sixth in a series, a course. And today I'm going to talk about something called dreamspace. So I offered people in the seminar a couple of bits of video this week to have a look at. One of which, in particular, opened a different kind of way of doing theoretical praxis, and it opened that sort of from a notion of poetics, and so it's one of the things I want to talk about a little bit. And so dream space and poetics, these are going to be things that are kind of connected, and I want to talk about a little bit in the second half really of tonight. And I first of all wanted to kind of give a context for some of those remarks, although it might seem a little bit odd when the remarks come round, because it probably won't be obvious as the context. But the context is essentially some of the work, obviously, that I've been doing in the project, but in particular a kind of conversation between two different thoughts. And I was reading through these things this week, these two different sources, both of which I've come across relatively recently. So I'm thinking about them in the context of the Freudian Spaceship project, but they're a kind of relatively recent moment in that kind of process of thought. And the two texts are one, an extremely interesting essay on Fanon and institutional psychoanalysis. An essay by someone called Camille Robci, Robcis. The essay is called Frantz Fanon, Institutional Psychotherapy and the Decolonization of Psychiatry. And it was published in the Journal of the History of Ideas last year, April 2020. And it's on Toscales and institutional psychiatry, but it's more importantly, it's on Fanon. And so it kind of connected into that, but it had something really interesting to say about Toscale, and it's got a lot of really interesting thoughts inside that essay. It's a very it almost articulates some of the ways I've been thinking about Fanon's relationship to institutional psychoanalysis. It almost articulates better than I could at the moment, definitely better than I could at the moment in a way. So it's a really interesting and useful piece, because I think it can give a very good background context into thinking about why Fanon is an interesting companion to schizoanalysis. In a sense, it's through the relationship that schizoanalysis has to institutional psychoanalysis, institutional psychiatry rather, which is this practice that begins with Toscales, Francois Toscales. So the two texts I was looking at were one, that essay, which was just this lovely. It's like when you read something, you think, "Oh God, yeah, exactly like that." It was this lovely essay that I read that kind of articulated a lot of connections that I think are really useful and really interesting. And so it was this particular essay, I say, about institutional psychiatry and Fanon. And the other piece is I'm reading this book, Asylums, by Irving Goffman. I read a little bit of Goffman years and years ago, in terms of he has this kind of performance theory that we have these roles that we're performing for each other. And I read it, and he's a sociologist. And I read a little bit of him years and years ago, but a friend of mine's in prison at the moment, and I sent them a copy of this book, a copy for me, because I thought I know of this book, and Eric had mentioned it to me, and this might be a really useful thing to read if you're in prison, because it's Asylums. It's about something that Hoffman calls total institutions, which are these particular kind of institutions that you can't escape from. So religious orders also form a kind of total institution, and they're a particular kind of institution, a particular kind of social organisation that is called total because of this incapacity to escape from it. And obviously in an asylum or in a prison, that's because of the walls and being locked up. In a religious order, it's because of a kind of a voluntary withdrawal from outside of society. But you can imagine this concept of a total institution defined in some sense as one from which you have no escape, actually being a kind of broader, slightly more interesting way of thinking about, in some sense, what people call neoliberal capitalism, where there's often sort of argued to be sort of, in a sense, no escape. Sometimes that sense of capitalist realism that people talk about, where it's more difficult to imagine, the end of the world than the end of capitalism, often attributed to people like Mark Fisher and various other Marxist theorists. I can't remember one of the guys' names at the moment, some famous Marxist theorist. I can't remember the person's name. Often attributed to them as well. But that often articulates a sense of no escape, and so quite often it's neo-liberal capitalism is kind of identified as this sort of new form in which there's almost no ideological escape, no escape from the space, the headspace of that. So Irving Hoffman's concept of a total institution, specifically, as I say, these institutions from which there's no escape, seems to have some kind of interest and relevance, just generally within our contemporary sort of wider situation, our society, our particular kind of society as a kind of institution from which there's no escape. So I've been reading that Hoffman alongside this essay on Fanon, and it was really interesting. There's in the third chapter, and I'm going to ask some of my seminar students to have a look at these two pieces together as well, because I'd be interested in what they think, to read these two together. So in the third chapter of Hoffman, Hoffman's Asylum book, the third chapter, which is called Institutional Ceremonies. So the first chapter, he develops a thing about the inmate. In the second, he develops a thing called the staff. So he has, it's called the inmate world and the staff world. And in the third chapter, he talks about these institutional ceremonies. And what he's talking about there is a kind of relationship between these two categories that exist in the total institution. Categories that people kind of are sucked into, if you like, roles that they play and have to play, and these two categories are the staff or the inmate. And so in the first two chapters he kind of outlines what they are. He outlines a whole bunch of really quite interesting stuff, all of it quite negative, all of it from quite a difficult perspective, but in this third chapter it's to do with the interrelationships between these categories of staff and inmate within these particular kind of organizations called total institutions. And what he discusses in a couple of pages there are things that could almost look like the same kind of activities Guattari or someone describes as part of institutional psychiatry. But he's describing them. He's describing these practices in quite a negative way, and so it was this kind of conflict between Hoffman seeming to describe what might be thought of as the same practices in a negative way, and institutional psychiatry's description of these in a positive way. It was this kind of sense that these were talking about the same object but getting quite different takes on it, and that's always, I think, an interesting place to think. It's an interesting place to kind of wonder what's going on here. So the kind of practices that Hoffman's talking about were things like ceremonies in which role reversal takes place or role shifting takes place. So those two roles of the staff and the inmate. In these institutional ceremonies, there's, he says, a series of kind of practices which organize a kind of interrelationship between these different roles, making them co-complicit in the institution, if you like, or co-evolving, perhaps. And these ceremonies, take a variety of different forms, and you can kind of think of role reversal a little bit like a Saturnalia. So on a day of the year, the kind of social hierarchies are inverted, as it were, but only temporarily, and only, as it were, to reinforce the existing hierarchies. That would be the kind of thought. And so this is kind of what's Hoffman's thought, is that there are these strange practices that he can witness. He does what he does this thing called ethnography. And there are these strange practices that you can witness that look like they are the breaking down of something like social roles, but in fact, they look like they're the breaking down of social roles, but my sound seems to be making a strange thing there. I'm getting a glitch. I wonder if you're getting a glitch as well. Sorry. It's going red. Yeah, that's breaking out right completely. That's quite strange. Okay. Anyway, so yes, so instead of these social roles actually being reversed, this kind of Saturnalian role reversal is a kind of way of reinforcing them. That's kind of Hoffman's thought. And so he identifies a couple of things. One of the things he identifies is the institutional newspaper or bulletin, popping away. So that institutional bulletin, which we might think of, and I mean, even says something like, your staff allow themselves to be interviewed. There's a kind of pretense. You can imagine it a bit like a school newspaper or something like that, where you kind of think it's the acting out of press freedom or free speech, and in fact everyone kind of knows that the game has a particular set of limits, and so you might think about that in terms of or a prison radio station run by the prisoners, but completely acceptable to the prison authorities. These kind of spaces in which there is offered freedom from the role or reversal of the role, perhaps, as when the inmate or the prisoner is kind of interviewing a member of staff, for example. These kind of things offer sort of a little bit of flexibility or vagueness of the roles or reversal of them. These things are actually, Hoffman suggests, ways of kind of reinforcing the social roles. And he that kind of way of talking about that, he begins to talk about staff having a kind of he talks about staff as though those that want to make the inmate more free, more cared for, are actually in practice reinforcing the institutional logic that makes these two categories of inmate and staff in the first place. So there's a kind of really quite sort of insidious. It's insidious in Hoffman. There's a really quite insidious way in which anything you do is already captured inside the logic of the institution. Anything you do. So even if you're trying to make positive institutional reforms, they're still captured inside the logic of the institution. This is sort of what Hoffman seems to be saying, and it's a very clear example of a particular kind of relationship to a social system or an ecosystem when we begin to talk about something like its internal logic or it having a logic. And so it's something that we often find, as I say, thought about in terms of our relationship to neoliberal capitalism. It's as though, as I say, there's no escape from it, and everything you do is somehow going to be recuperated into it and made part of the production of capitalism rather than its resistance. But here was a paragraph. So Hoffman's talking about like how he calls house organs, these newspapers or these newsletters or journals that might be established inside total institutions, prisons, asylums, etc. And so he sort of shows how they might be a bit sort of self-reinforcing. But then he gets to this point that really begins to make me think of the practices of institutional psychiatry. And I'm going to quote from Hoffman. This is on page 92 of Asylums in chapter 3. Although house organs have been customary for some time, and he's writing in the early 60s here, he'd done his ethnography, I believe, in the late 50s. Although house organs have been customary for some time, it is only recently that a somewhat similar form of role release has appeared in total institutions. I refer here to the several forms of self-government and group therapy. Typically, the inmates speak the lines, and a congenial member of the staff performs the supervision. Again, a kind of compact between inmates and staff is found. The inmates are given the privilege of spending some time in a relatively unstructured or egalitarian milieu, and even the right to voice complaints. In return, they are expected to become less loyal to the counter-mores and more receptive to the ideal for self that the staff defines for them. Now, it's that reference there to group therapy and equality and a self-government and all these kind of things that I think make me think of institutional psychiatry, because in a sense that's kind of one element of institutional psychiatry. So I think that so it makes me think of it in that sense. There is another element of institutional psychoanalysis, perhaps rather than psychiatry, and I think when I talk about institutional psychoanalysis, I'm thinking more of the kind of relationship that Guattari develops than is developed by Tosquel and Uri at St Albans and in those places. And in institutional psychoanalysis, one of the things that Guattari also talks about is not just this kind of relationship to self-government, but also the fact, and this is spoken about in terms of the grid, for example, but also the fact that certain techniques need to be made, and this is the role of the transversal primarily, but certain techniques need to be made and developed that show the unconscious desire of the institution itself to the members of the institution as much as anyone else. And so there's two different things there. There's the self-government aspect, which I think Hoffman is particularly kind of talking about as though there's a kind of difficulty here in that any kind of government, any kind of self-government here is still part of what we might call the logic of governmentality that governs the institution, still part of the institutional logic, if you like. There's that, and then there's this other element that Guattari sort of develops around trying to somehow construct an analytic process in regard to the organisation, the institution itself, to try and reveal its unconscious desires to the members of the institution or the organisation. And so, obviously, in a sense, if it's those same practices, let's say those practices of self-government, the newspaper, or another point he describes a few pages later, he describes another example, and this really makes me think of Laborde. An interesting institutional ceremony, Hoffman says, often connected with the annual party and the Christmas celebration, is the institutional theatrical. And obviously in Laborde, I mean, it's not quite the same. It's not a Christmas play, but at Laborde there's also this particular role for the play. The focus, one of the seminar participants brought forward the film about that, The Little Things, I think it's called, if I remember right. That sort of, it has the play kind of sort of central as part of the practice of what we might call institutional psychiatry at Laborde. So these kind of things that in from one perspective look liberatory, from Hoffman's perspective look like complicity forming, and so it's trying to think about that strange sense, because one of the things that seems important in reading Fanon is deeply aware of complicity, and so if Hoffman was right, it seems and that in a sense all that's really going on is ceremonies of reinforcement of the institutional logic. If Hoffman was right, then it seems almost bizarre that institutional psychiatry wouldn't somehow try to articulate this relationship to complicity. And in fact, that's I think what's missing inside Hoffman's analysis, is the internal relationship to the dynamic of institutional psychiatry and the dynamic of institutional psychotherapy. Because what does that actually start from? It does not start from a process of something like simple a need for greater equality, a need for more humane caring practices, a need for some kind of expressive freedom, a need for a minimal of limitations, a need for a minimal of enforcement powers. It doesn't start from that kind of moral perspective. In fact, it starts from something much more kind of deadly, in a sense. It begins, and I think this is a quote that I'm going to use here, because I think this is a quote from the essay by Robchu, the one that I was talking about, and it begins to focus on exactly what is kind of, as it were, the abstract machine, the motivating dynamic that is beginning to be articulated by institutional psychotherapy or psychiatry. as I say, for Hoffman, it might be something like equality, but that becomes complicit, or moral value judgments, so those become complicit with the institutional logic. But actually, for institutional psychiatry itself, there's something else going on. And so I'll just go to that quote. So Toscels, who's one of the people at the sort of centre of this, Toscels liked to repeat that in the course of his life he had been exposed to multiple physical and ideological occupations. As a Catalan citizen fighting Spanish imperialism, as an activist in the POUM struggling against Stalinist domination, as an opponent to fascism first in Spain and later in the resistance in Vichy France, as a refugee incarcerated in the deplorable conditions of French internment camps. These various forms of segregation, colonization or incarceration had rendered him particularly sensitive to the dangers of concentrationism, which he also called le tout pouvoir, the all power. Reminds me of the All Father, Thor or Odin rather. Le tout pouvoir, the all power. Concentrationism was the potential of any institution or any group to become authoritarian, oppressive, discriminatory and exclusionary. Now note there the potential. It's not the inevitability, it's not a necessity, it's merely one of the potentials. As the war had made clear, to continue with the quote, concentrationism threatened more than our modes of social and political organisation. It was also a behaviour, a psychic disposition. Alienation was indeed always both social and psychic. It is in this sense that Tosquel referred to Marx and Freud as the two legs of institutional psychotherapy. When one leg walked, the other needed to follow. Both were complementary and inseparable in understanding and fighting against the voluntary servitude in which humans lived. It is at this crossroads of Marxism and psychoanalysis that institutional psychotherapy was born as a tool to diagnose and also to fight against double alienation. And I think this kind of moment is crucial here. I'm just going to drop this level a little tiny bit. It seems to keep popping right off the top. Sorry, let's try and so this idea of concentrationism as one of the potentials of an institution or a group. I think this speaks much more to the kind of dynamics of institutional psychotherapy, because it's only one of them. It's not the inevitable end result of any institution or group. It's one of the possible dangers, and it's a particularly difficult danger because it's so catastrophic. And obviously, concentrationism here is coming, almost certainly from the kind of dynamics and logics behind concentration camps. So, concentrationism is this particular kind of intense relationship to kind of borders and efficiency and order and, as it were, the machinic in some kind of particular way, like as though it needed to be as clean and as efficient as possible, as though it needed to be kind of spotless and without any kind of flexibility, any fluidity. It's very rigid, it's very fixed, it's very difficult to cope with in terms of any kind of differentiation. And so this kind of concentrationism is very close to that logic of identity that we mentioned last week, which was for Guattari distinct from a logic of singularization. So concentrationism, this kind of logic of identity, this logic of getting everything into a sort of a rigidly ordered kind of situation. This potential that exists in any institutional group to become authoritarian, oppressive, discriminatory and exclusionary is as it were one particular dynamic, the other dynamic of which is for institutions and groups to enable autonomy, to overcome scarcity or lack, and to generate a kind of a communal let's say a communal justice almost, as people, like, as it were, pay attention to each other and to a certain extent regulate each other. And that kind of group potential obviously is also very, very closely connected to Marx's sense of labour power. That kind of group potential, that institution, we can think of, in a sense, the non-total institutions such as factories. That would be an institution that wasn't total. The reason being, you go home at night, and you don't sort of in the institution when you walk out the factory gate. But those kind of institutions or groups, the capacity for them to enable autonomy or overcome things like scarcity or issues like this, those kind of potentials also exist in this kind of collectivized, this group and community kind of level. And so I think that's what institutional psychotherapy is kind of aiming to be able to, break out of. And this is very closely connected to this sense that's always there from Anti-Oedipus onwards, and always there in kind of Deleuze and Guattari's approach to, let's say, schizoanalysis, psychoanalysis. It's very close to this idea of maintaining this relationship to the fascist within, the kind of potential of that fascist within. Now, one of the things I want to try and is note is in this Toscales quote a tiny little notion. As the war had made clear to him, concentrationism threatened more than our modes of social and political organisation. It was also a behaviour, a psychic disposition. And it's that psychic disposition that I want to kind of set up as the framing for some of the comments I'm going to make in a moment about poetics and dream space. Because I think that the kind of way in which a psychic disposition is challenged is kind of crucial. Because in a sense, Hoffman is already within a particular psychic disposition in which, the kind of logics of the institutions overwrite everything else, and there is no kind of escape from these things. And in a sense, he's kind of locked into this kind of psychic disposition in which that kind of thing is naturalized, and this is the psychic disposition that kind of exists. This is one of the ones that is kind of very, very prominent within capitalism, the idea of its kind of natural state, that capitalism is somehow a kind of naturalized form of political economy. It's just the way we kind of work, as it were, if we let our natural instincts and natural inclinations and natural dispositions play out, and develop a kind of interactive emergent behaviour. And this kind of relationship to psychic disposition, in a sense, makes it a question of what will be the tactics for shifting a psychic disposition. What kind of dynamics would be of interest if the goal was to somehow alter a psychic disposition. Okay, so I'm going to have a quick pause there for about 3 or 4 minutes. So just stretch your legs, maybe kind of locate yourself somewhere in your body or whatever you're doing, and try and just relax a little bit. And I'll be back in about 4 or 5 minutes. And we can have a think about poetics and dream space. So welcome back for the second half. We'll talk a little bit about dream space. So philosophy contains within its methodology a particularly potent desire, located more often than not around the idea of necessity. Necessity for Marx is in relationship to freedom, in a kind of inverse relation. For Marx, the realm of freedom begins where the realm of necessity ends, which is in many ways in sharp contrast to philosophy, which often appears to present necessity as a kind of achievement of the intellect. For example, it's common to find a distinction within philosophy between something contingent and something necessary, let's say between two types of linguistic proposition. On the one hand, a contingent proposition. It's raining outside, I'm 5 foot 10 inches tall, I have a beard. all propositions about which it may or may not be the case. Facts, we might say, although that's a rather grand name for these trivialities. I have a beard, but it's just a contingent feature. Accidental, it could easily be otherwise. I could have a shave, for example, and would no longer have a beard. So on the one hand, something like a contingent fact, something that could have been otherwise, could be otherwise, that a contingency expresses this sense of could be otherwise, easily lends itself to being associated with something like a feeling of freedom. Freedom as the sense that something is not necessary, as the sense that our response to the situation, could be otherwise. On the other hand, we find that philosophy associates necessity most often with something that seems peculiarly human or peculiarly constitutive of the human, with reason itself. Reason as the realm of necessities discovered in those things that get called a priori statements, things known before experience, from within the logic of logic, immanent to and arising from reason itself, necessities that impose themselves on us like an overwhelming sensation that possesses us, occupies us. This realm of reason, this space of thought, with its laws and logics and necessities, somehow becomes the space of freedom, perhaps nowhere more insidiously than in Spinoza. Yet freedom is always a kind of acceptance, or to use a concept that is central to this project, a logic of compliance. Freedom in this situation is a little like the good bourgeois. It's demonstrated in the capacity to comply, in the capacity to be mature enough to know the limits of reason, but also being mature enough to know the limits of the human in the face of reason. So for philosophy, freedom is too often bound into this curious compulsion to comply with reason's necessities. So these two subterranean senses of freedom exist in philosophy. On the one hand, as a kind of contingency or accident, on the other as a kind of compliance or submission to necessity. These senses aren't opposed, rather they operate as two sides of the same abstract machine, two modes of expression of the same machinery of thought, one in which the connections are to be, as it were, causal, where commitments and entailments run like lines of compulsion from one moment of a syllogism to the next, from one moment of an argument to the next. One of the strange reproaches to philosophy that arises from poetry is with regard this sense of necessity. So poetics operates without the sense of causal connection that is deeply embedded within philosophical concepts of reason. It can do so because it can deploy the necessities of association, necessities that do not pre-exist the associations. If the necessities pre-existed the association, somehow making the particular association the result of a prior causal necessity, as though somehow the association between a ship and travel pre-existed the experience of travel on ships, then the association would be little more than the expression of necessary conjunction. We would associate one thing with another because all we are doing is recognizing that they are associated by some more fundamental process in the world. By contrast, poetics produces necessities as the result of association, rather than producing associations as a result of necessities. If the poetics is powerful enough, the necessity it produces in its association is necessary enough, sometimes so necessary as to be absolutely necessary enough. And here we can glimpse another sense of freedom, one produced through association, one that is discovered as it is created, one that is in some sense an inversion of Marx, in that the realm of necessity begins where the realm of freedom ends. Marx and poetics offer two ways of encountering necessity and freedom quite distinct from philosophy in its rationality. They offer a different abstract machine, one that is not searching for the causal connections, whether they be natural or rational, but one that is producing necessities from freedom, producing associations from creative conjunctions. This particular abstract machine is operating when the artist is struggling to find the right tone, or the right conjunction of tones. It is also operating when the worker is struggling to find the right tool or machine, the right assemblage. In both cases, a kind of creative play of conjunctions isn't absent-minded, isn't idle. Rather, things are tried out in order to reach the point at which it works. When it works, and it's useful to remember that the id is just a posh jargon name for the it, then that it that we refer to when we say something like it works is the moment of necessity. The worker and the artist, and here I'm talking about these personae in their sort of non-alienated state, in what might be an idealized image. The worker and the artist aim to make it work. They conjoin, disjoin and rejoin themselves with objects, marks, others and networks, sometimes reaching momentary metastability where the machine just works, where it hits the sweet spot. Maintaining that balance, that flow, is to encounter the necessity of the machinic, the moment of necessity that flows from the active creative forces of life. Now for Marx, of course, there is a more basic sense to his formula that the realm of freedom begins where the realm of necessity ends. And it's something like, you cannot be free until your needs are met. Needs. Those things which must be met before something else, free activity, can begin. Needs are notoriously plastic, however. Even the basics, such as food, are subject to transformation. They're converted into techniques of the body. Without touching on the complex role that food takes within our contemporary Western world, we only have to note that the roles of feasting and fasting to see how food is not a simple system of meeting needs, but operates as a complex system of transformative techniques. A transformative techniques is perhaps the name of the abstract machine at work in Marx and within poetics. A particular mode of relationship with the world in which repetition and reproduction take second fiddle to difference and production. In both cases, the question is more like, what can the world be, rather than what is the world? What can the world be? If we talk of, as we do in our project, a new earth, one that is not dominated and overcoded by the logic of capital and commodity, then this new earth arises from a dream. Deleuze once offered an insight in an aphorism that's relevant here. Do not get trapped in the dream of the other. The first moment of this trap might be to feel the dream as insubstantial, as having no power, because it cannot be situated within some kind of chain of causal relation that matters. This is a dream of the other, one in which the dream is an accident, a free contingency of surreal associations. Yet this is too crude a concept of the dream. It rends waking and dream states, offering the waking state as one of light, the dream state as one of darkness, operating with a distinction between the two that immediately devalues the dream in the hierarchy of waking and dreaming. And we can see this logic at work in the calls to wake up, in the dismissive language of sheeple and zombies and stupidity, a language that speaks from a self-declared position of being awake, of seeing clearly, a language that explains the failure to make a new earth as rooted in people having been somehow nullified in their desires. The awakened speak of the rest of the earth as though it were little more than dumb flesh. They prescribe thinking like them as the answer, although they couch it in terms such as education, as though self-destructive behaviours were a matter of bad choices. And if we only knew more, then we'd minimise such failures of reason. This is the dream of the other that has captured us, one in which we think that what we think is right. This is the dream of philosophy in too many of its forms, its major forms. A dream that is undermined by a thought from within, no doubt, but that still overwhelms thinking too easily. Rather than being called to awaken, we need rather to learn how to dream a necessary freedom and the freedom of necessity. These are the strange dreams of the sorcerer and the psychoanalyst and the revolutionary, the ones that they know are no longer dreams, but that speak to them, that let them see that which they cannot see. Intuitions of the imperceptible, we might call them. Such intuitions arise in the intervals, in the gaps, in the in-betweens, and the transports between one space and another, between the face and the mask, for example, which is not to say between the authentic and the inauthentic, but rather between one mode of relation and another. Let me just call to memory that refrain in the project, the one-to-one, the group and the community, these three modes of relation, this legend, as it were, for a map-making process, as a tool of disruption of the dreaming. There is a one-to-one relation to the dream, a relation of intimacy, a relation of the body with the personality in which the dream is felt, lingering in the morning. or where the dream returns time and again to the same point, or where the dream is a screen through which the world retains enough to be livable. I have my dreams and my dreams have me, and the intimacy of this is never adequately expressed in any account I give. Yet the group dream also takes me, grips me, perhaps as a kind of shared family, perhaps as a shared game. Then there are the dreams that constitute a community, the imagined communities of nationhood or the communities of strategic identity. To whom does the dream happen? Where is the dream? If the dreamer is thought as existing in some specific individual, you or me, then do we not have collective dreams? We dream. Whilst it might be a kind of intellectual game to talk about the dreamer being dreamed and to wonder whether I'm a dream, whether I'm a king dreaming of being a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming of being a king, these kind of games. What they do speak to is the volatility of borders within the dream space, the slips and slides, the morphing and mutating. They all speak to the power of the associative dimension of production, to an acausal realm of necessities. Nothing is more necessary than the nightmare. Its imposition is precisely this awareness of being trapped in the dream of the other. But whilst that imposition might be most acutely encountered in the nightmare, its smell lingers across the dream space. It lingers in the materials of association, the elements and ingredients and already existing associations that make up the dream space. Adrift in the ocean of plastic waste, a dream space surrounds and sweeps below each island of waking. William James says somewhere that each of us might be an island, but that what this implies is that our separation at the surface hides a deeper connection between the waves. The earth. This earth dreams, has a dream space, one in which I might dream as easily from the encounter with a viral companion that has taken up residence as from the compressions and intensities of the singular libidinal economy that organises my body. That dream space is not an ideological or symbolic structure because it is primarily a flow of bodies and connections. Take the example of the women who took up a protest for life at Greenham Common. They camped at the gates of the Air Force Base, offering up bodies of resistance to the machinery of warfare. This singularity arose in part because of nightmares. Shared nightmares of nuclear destruction, shared across letters in newspapers, words in conversations and poems of resistance. This shared nightmare took place across a moment and place, taking hold of the dreamers, and in doing so shifting the tone of the waking world, transforming it, opening it, listening and responding with a call to life. Maybe it needed a particular moment in order for the nightmare not to be dismissed as mine, as my reaction. Maybe it needed a moment of collective consciousness raising to prepare the ground, a women's liberation movement to provide a network, and the political conjunction of two governments, the US and the UK, having to find a particular place within the geographic distance of targets. Maybe it needed all these factors, but it also needed this sense that the dream space spoke, that it was capable to hear underneath the clamour for peace through strength a kind of runaway machine and an earth that spoke against it, that called for another world. There is nothing more futile than asking someone who wants something done, something to change, to dream. Let's make a broad and overly sweeping claim here. Most of the time, the answer to the question, what has to be done, is obvious. Only rarely is there actually a need to consider seriously various options. Usually, such considerations reveal competing forces at work, with each having its own obvious responses. The difficulty is that this obviousness is like an acquired taste. We have acquired it whether we like it or not. Its impact is felt across our bodies and within our social lives. Yet the obvious, that which is taken to be obvious, is not the result of conscious processes. In fact, it cannot be the result of conscious processes, as it's one of the grounds of them. In the face of the obvious, we cannot help it. In the face of the obvious, we can resist, and via training, repetition and practice, shift some of the responses away from a kind of automatism, yet the obvious itself is like an atmosphere. It is, to adapt Guattari's concept, the grounded content of an ethico-aesthetic domain. Within a particular domain, such as that of this earth in which capital has become the dominant logic, a field of obviousness arises as a kind of dream space. An ocean in which islands appear distinct, but which still rest on the same earth. So the strategy of resisting the obvious that is part of a series of oppressive, divisive habits is a valuable tool. However, the need for a new field of obviousness still remains, and it's through the dream that the new obvious is to be created. This new field of the obvious is constituted via the associative power of the dream as a series of new necessities. What was once unimaginable now becomes the everyday. Again, this sounds like a prescription for the future, for the new earth that rests on too flimsy a foundation. Where is power? Where are the forces of production, the confrontations and coalitions that will or must occur if this world is to be transformed? Yet it's not a prescription of some wishful thinking. Rather, it's a description of the capitalist revolution, that revolution we live in the aftermath of. Or rather, it's a description of the flows which capital was able to parasitize in order to become the ubiquitous natural fact that it appears to us as. So yeah, that last point, I think I'm interested in trying to sort of develop a little bit or think a bit more about. And the point really is that the processes which brought capitalism to dominance as a logic of the world, and in the words I'm using here, and in so doing constituting a new dream space of capital, the idea is that these processes are not specific to capital. So in those relationships you have factors such as the capitalist, the power relations, property relations, but crucially you have an underlying logic of enclosure, and I think that's possibly one of the most interesting things. And it's interesting to try and deal with that or think about that in contrast perhaps to or alongside the Marxist sense of historical development that you can find here. Because obviously for Marx, when he says all history is a history of class struggle, the kind of basic axiom or slogan of what is sometimes called historical materialism, and Marx and Engels offer there a kind of account of social development that obviously precedes capitalism and is in, as it were, a process that's not specific to capital. So that logic of enclosure that I think actually is sort of perhaps more interestingly central. It's a kind of logic that capital in a sense parasitizes. That logic of enclosure I think is somehow easier to get at or easier to be kind of thought about within a kind of schizoanalytic framework in which we're not talking so much about class struggle being the motor of all historical change, but in which we're talking about what they call social desiring production, which in a sense is a different name for the similar kind of dynamic. And in one sense you can read Marx very broadly and talk about class struggle as social desiring production, if you include within class struggle everything that you can think of in the everyday world, rather than just the economic, the sort of narrowly delimited economic. So in one sense, schizoanalysis can be read as a kind of Marxism almost, particularly after the new Marxism of the 60s, perhaps. And on the other hand, it looks like it's talking about something like a different kind of logic, a logic of enclosure, rather than whatever the logic is inside class struggle. And I mean, that's an interesting question at the moment. What is that logic? Generally, it would seem to be a logic around something to do with need, but also something to do with control of that. And again, as soon as you access control, notions of control, it seems that something like enclosure begins to be a more interesting way of beginning to think a kind of generalized logic. And here one of the crucial things is to think about enclosure in both physical and psychological sense, and in some sense as the psyche as a result of an enclosed space or a kind of enclosure space. And so what we need to kind of in a sense think is a double enclosure, a double alienation, and that the psychic enclosure is an enclosure within a particular kind of dream space. And so dream space is, as it were, a kind of naming of this particular element of social desiring production, if you like, of that broadened concept of a class struggle that might include, all the elements of everyday life and desire. And so I think this concept of dream space, which is one that me and Eric have kind of talked about quite a lot, and which we've sort of batted around a fair bit over the years. I think this concept of dream space offers us this way of beginning to kind of conceptualize that element of the double alienation, the double enclosure, the psychic as well as the physical, because it's like right on the borders of that. It's both physical and psychological. It's neither merely physical nor merely psychological. It's a continuous process of embodied enclosure that in embodying the enclosure encloses the psyche as well. Okay, so I'm going to wander off now. Thank you very much if anyone was listening. It's always good to, if you've got any comments, drop them by. Happy to have a chat and a natter. If you're in Free University Brighton and thinking of dropping along to the seminar, you'll be most welcome, and I'll see you in about 5 minutes. I will open the Zoom room, so just drop by when you can. For everybody else, thank you very much, and I'll maybe catch you in a week or two. See you around.
The gorilla studies. He doesn't rap. He studies and keeps his mouth shut. Study, children.